This copyrighted feature originates in Detroit, and all characters, places, and incidents used are fictitious.
It's an honor to have somebody who I have the pleasure of talking to a few times over the years. Paul Carnegie, welcome back.
Yeah, it's nice to be here, and glad to see you very much. My pleasure.
For our audience, Paul, can you tell them how in the world did he got over to WXYZ?
Okay, I didn't understand the first part of that question. What about WXYZ?
How did he get started over
How did I get
WXYZ?
started at WXYZ? Well, depends upon how long you want this interview to be, because I can start at the very bitter beginning and work my way through it. But in simple terms, I was 17 years old, and I was able to get a job in radio right out of high school. I lasted at that for about 2 weeks and got fired because I couldn't get up in the morning to go on the air. I went home and told my girlfriend, who lived up at the end of the block, about my problems. It so happens that her father was a podiatrist, and one of his clients, one of his patients, was the wife of Fred Wolf, who was the morning DJ at WXYZ. And Mrs. Wolf had told the doctor that Fred was very upset about things, that his record spinner at WXYZ was being drafted. And he was really upset because the record spinner played a very important part in the radio show because of a lot of things going on, a lot of gimmicks, a lot of commercials, music thrown in, and conversation and interviews and all kinds of things. So it demanded somebody who was pretty sharp. And he was going to the Army. And so she said, this is what Mrs. Wolf had told Dad. I said, if there's an opening then in WXYZ, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go apply for that job as Fred Wolf's record spinner. I immediately, without invitation, went down to WXYZ, walked in uninvited, told the secretary I'd like to apply for the job as the record spinner for Fred Wolf. And she said, well, I'll let you talk to our manager, who's Jack McCarthy, who we all know was the Green Hornet, the voice of, anyhow. And so I was able to see Jack McCarthy right away. And Jack said, well, young man, I'm sorry, that particular job of the record spinner has been taken over by our office messenger. At that time, WXYZ had a TV station in one location in the Maccabees building. Radio was in the mansion on Jefferson Avenue, and the general offices were downtown in the Stroh building in downtown Detroit. And so twice a day, my job, because I got hired to do that job, was to drive with information, books, whatever they needed from the station to the general office, and then back again, and then again in the afternoon. Yeah, he hired me to do the job as office messenger, which was great. I loved it. I was then at WXYZ, and guess who I had a chance to actually spend every day with was the crew, the actors, all the bunch from WXYZ and the Lone Ranger production and the Sergeant Presser production. There was a room downstairs in the lower level of the mansion that was the lounge, they called it, where the actors and everybody went to go when it was time to sit and wait to do whatever they had to do in the next rehearsal or whatever. A lot of time was spent down there. And so I would, talk with them all day long, became friends with all the actors because I got to know them very, very well. So that is maybe the longer than you wanted to hear version of how I got to WXYZ. And there was more coming. If you had wanted to hear what that was without you asking a question, I'd be happy to keep on going.
Please, Paul, keep going.
Keep going. Okay. Okay. Well, I worked at that job as office messenger for about 6 months or so. And lo and behold, the draft came up again. Yes, one of the sound effects men for the Lone Ranger program was being drafted. and there was a job open for sound effects at the Lone Ranger program in Sergeant Preston. And I was right there raising my hand. Chuck Livingston, Chuck, I'm available for the job. Chuck said, well, if you want it, you got it. So I got the job as sound effects for the Lone Ranger and the Sergeant Preston show. And I was the low man on the totem pole. Of course, there were five guys who made up the sound effects department. We had Jim Hengstebeck, who worked in the control room with the records, and then Tony Caminita, Don Davenport, Chuck Bugune, and myself. And we each had our specific jobs. Tony was the lead man in the sound room, which a room was actually separate from the actors' studio at WXYZ. And there was a sound lock in between the two rooms. And my job was, among others, I did studio sound as well as sound in the sound room. And studio sound comprised of actually, when there was anything to be done on microphone, coordinated with the actors. And the job that I had that I just had to, I hated with a passion, but I had to do it. If there was any kind of fight going on and it was time to hit somebody in the face, sock on jaw, that was my job. I had a rubber pad with a cloth on it in my left hand. My right hand, that was the sock on jaw. And sometimes there'd be multiple fights going on and I would be smacking people for forever, it seemed like. And it hurt like the dickens, but I had to do it. That was part of the job. And then when I wasn't in the studio, I would be in the sound room working at the table for the horse hooves and things like that. And the horse hoof thing was sort of interesting, as I'm sure everybody knows. The horse hooves were actually small toilet plungers in a large box with dirt and gravel in it. And each of us were part of the horse. We actually had a hierarchy as far as who did what. If it was just one horse, like the Ranger's horse, it would be Tony and Don would do their parts. And when they added a second horse, Chuck and I would be the horse part of the horse too. So when you take a look at the hierarchy and the seniority, I was the last man. So I got actually for a couple of years while I did sound effects, I was the professional horse's butt on Scout. And that was one of the joys I had, but anyhow, we liked doing horse hooves. Part of the job too, of the job of the studio sound man, was to coordinate the doors. The sound lock had a door at the studio for the actors. There was a door into the sound room, and the doors had to be coordinated because in radio, the microphone and where it's located was very important. And the actors would be on mic, close to the microphone, or back off mic, depending upon the circumstances. And to get the better sound, we didn't do much door work with the Lone Ranger, but in the Sergeant Preston show, we did more with that. And the way that would work, the door would be opened in the actor's studio, and the door would be closed actually in the sound room and just opened a crack, and the microphone turned up by that door. And so the door would open and close. You'd hear a little click, but at the same time, the microphone in the actor studio would pick up the sound of the door, which was off mic. Conversely, a door on mic, the door to the studio for the actors was closed and the sound door was opened, so that you wouldn't get any echo effect of the door. So you actually had a true arrangement of on mic and off mic. Okay, one more thing, that a little inside here that was important to the Lone Ranger program, and that's John Todd. God love him, what a great man he was. John was in his 70s at the time, and he, of course, sat in one corner of the actor studio, and Brace Beamer, the Lone Ranger, sat in the other corner, and they always worked separate against each other, and the microphone facing each other, I should be specific. And so John would sit in his chair waiting for his chance to go on mic to do his part, read his lines. And John, once in a while, we had to be careful because John would doze off if there were long scenes and there was nothing going on for Tonto. So one of my jobs was to make sure that John was awake to do his lines. I would, the page before John had to do his lines, I would have on my script, John. I would go to make sure John was awake. So that was one of the jobs that I had as the doing sound effects for the Lone Ranger and Sergeant Preston. You want to hear some more?
Sure do. Keep it going, Paul.
Okay. Well, you've turned me on. It's hard to turn to the off button is broken. I got lucky and unlucky later on in 52. Well, let's back up just a tiny bit. In early 52, the Trendle Campbell Muir at that particular time decided they were going to try to revive the Green Hornet program. And they were going to do shows on the Mutual Network on a sustaining basis without commercials. And so what was done, the old transcriptions were collected and put in a particular order that they wanted the shows to be presented. And at that time in radio, you could not have the sound of sirens on the radio. So the shows, the scripts were not always available. They didn't always have the scripts for all of these Green Hornet shows. So Chuck gave me the job of, in my off time when we weren't doing any programs, I would listen to all of the shows and make notes of when in the program, if any, there was any sirens. So that when the shows were put on the air, which were being done from the two, of course, there are 15-minute transcriptions, 2 to make half an hour show, so that during the show, whenever there was a record that had a siren, my job was to make a note so that when it came time to present the program on the air, there'd be a musical interlude of some sort with the narrator saying things and covering for what the lines would have been. And so that was one of the jobs I had, was to listen to all of those shows to make notes of when there was a sirens so that the shows could be presented. And I had a second job. I was hired by AFTRA at the same time because the actors were going to be getting royalties, apparently, for appearing on these shows. And they had no clue, for the most part, who the actors were on these shows. I just happened to have a real good ear knowing who sounded like what. And so AFTRA hired me to listen to the programs. While I was listening for sirens, I was also noting who the actors were in each of the shows. I'd report that to AFTRA, so the actors could be paid for their parts in these shows when the programs were on the air transcribed. And in the mid 52, a little bit later maybe, Trendle Campbell Muir was able to sell a 13-week flight of the Green Hornet live, and that was sponsored by Orange Crush. And the actor who had played the part of Kato, the last actor who had done that was, refresh my memory, Walden. Who was the actor?
Yeah,
it became Michael Tolan was the name he used when he moved to Hollywood. Yeah, and he, as I said, he was not with the crew anymore at WXYZ. He was in Hollywood, and they needed somebody to fill the part of Kato. And Chuck Livingston knew I was interested in doing things like acting. He asked me if I would like to try out for that particular part. And so I did, and we tried different sounds, and he said, okay, do it this way. And so for the final 13 weeks, the 26 episodes, I played the part of Kato. And when that was over, that was December of 1952, the sound department was filled by one of the returnees from the Army after having been drafted. Sound department was all taken care of. He didn't offer me any more jobs as an actor. And so I was bid a farewell, and that was the end of my career at WXYZ.
I think it's cool that the fact that you got to play such a seminal superhero figure at all is a legacy standing alone. That's amazing.
I look back and I'm saying, how could that have happened? First of all, just to be associated with that group of people in the Lone Ranger program and to touch base with, talk to them and be their friends, it was just more than a young man could have possibly ever imagined, especially one who had wanted to be in radio since he was just a little punker kid.
Paul,
So anyway, that's the story.
Paul, what was a typical day like? If you had to walk us through a day in terms of what time you got there, what time you did the rehearsals, walk me through a day.
I got there, as I remember, at about 11 o'clock, because we actually worked until 8 o'clock. We had an hour off for lunch because we worked 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. We got there at 11, and I'm trying to remember. It's been a long time, and I ain't no kid no more to have a memory for some of these things. I wish I could put them in order. But we would look at the script, decide what we're, as sound men, that is, what we were going to do. There would be a rehearsal. The time frame I don't recall exactly, and that was just a raw rehearsal of going through this, reading the parts, doing the script, doing the sound. Tony at the same time and Bill would both keep notes, track of what had to be done at what time on the script. Then I think there would be lunchtime after that, and then there would be another rehearsal, a production rehearsal, if I remember correctly. Maybe they're both the same, where they would go through. No, the next would be like a dress rehearsal. We'd actually did the show per the show with all the sound, all the things that were going to be done when it was broadcast live. And then, of course, the Lone Ranger program was done twice every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. In Eastern time, between 7 and 7:30, we did a program that was not sponsored. It was a sustaining program, and where commercials would be, and there was a musical interlude, and the opening and the closing would be generic without mentioning any sponsors whatsoever. And that particular show, that half-hour show from 7 to 7:30, was transcribed, and those transcriptions were then used and made available and sold to stations that weren't on the ABC network, who could buy the program and play the program locally on their station with local sponsorship. And so we had a 30-second break between 7:29:30 and 7:30 straight up. And as we went through that first show, we would have to make changes in our script because the timing was different between the two programs. The first program was a bit shorter in terms of commercial times, and there were some scenes and some parts of a scene that were included that we would cross off our script for the program that was run at 7:30. And then we'd start with that show at exactly 7:30 straight up. Fred Foy would start off with the announcement, and off we'd go again to do the show. And so that was pretty much the way it was done. It was a rehearsal, and then program. And it was a full day's work. One would not think so, right? But it was absolutely a full day's work.
Of the
actors. Little side note, a personal side note. Here comes 1952, and at that time I'd been married, and I needed work, and I did several different things. Nothing occurred to me that would work for me as far as radio in Detroit was concerned, and I was not inclined to go out of the market at that particular time. And so later in 1952, after I dabbled in some particular jobs, I just got this idea that I need something steady. And I applied for the Detroit Police Department. And interestingly enough, one of the actors on the Lone Ranger program, Bill Saunders, had been a Detroit policeman. And he actually helped me get on the Detroit Police Department, because when I first applied, I failed the eye test. And so I went to an optometrist right away who fitted me with glasses, who said, well, you'll probably get some improvement. Maybe you'll be able to pass the test. Well, I went back to WXYZ and met with Mr. Saunders. And I said, Bill, could you do something for me? Because he knew people in the Detroit Police Department. In fact, one of his good friends was Jim Lupton, who was the director of personnel, and he called the director of personnel for me. So next time around, I passed the physical. I got a chance to meet. In fact, he asked me to come up to his office. Lupton said, I'm sure you'll make it just fine in this department. So I got that job, and I was a cop for 5.5 years.
Talk about the actors, Paul. Who were really nice people? Were there some that were really terrifically nice to know?
Okay, it's a little hard to understand what you said there. I'm sorry,
Sure.
Walden.
The actors, are there any that you really liked personally?
Oh,
were there some that
I'll
were
tell
really
you.
nice, really nice?
I like them all. Some were a bit more friendly than others, but they were just the warmest, friendliest, nicest possible people you could ever meet. Nobody was standoff. 2 exceptions. The leads on the 2 programs we talked about were not the most friendly 2 guys in the world. But beyond that, Ernie Winstanley, great. Jimmy Fletcher, a wonderful guy. Gilly Shea, couldn't be the nicer guy. Harry Goldstein, yes.
Yep.
Yeah, yes, he was terrific. Oh, side note, when the Lone Ranger program and those programs ceased at all, he needed a job, and he had experience and training as a teacher and a teacher administrator. He went back into being an administrator at Southeastern High School, this high school I actually graduated from. So coincidence, side note, Harry Goldstein. And Paul Hughes, wonderful guy. Name a name, and I would have to agree. They were just outstanding. I couldn't have asked for a nicer bunch. Tony and I were very, Caminita's sound effects were extremely good. Several times we went on weekend excursions to Chicago to see the big town. He and I drove over there and stayed in a hotel where actors visited and stayed. So I'm trying to think of if there's anybody that I've not thought of that.
I heard Raleigh Parker was a really nice guy.
Raleigh Parker, oh yes, thank you for reminding me. Again, he's in that terrific guy. I mentioned Paul Hughes. Paul Hughes used to bring eggs he would sell eggs to the actors. Apparently he lived on a farm of some kind, and he brought eggs to the studio for the actors. But all in all, it was a time of life. Again, somebody who's 19, 20 years old was just wonderful. Couldn't ask for a better time in life, and I cherish every moment of it.
Describe to me the mansion.
The mansion?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, the mansion was on Jefferson Avenue, which was a main street in Detroit. And the front had a great big veranda, the front door that nobody used. The parking lot was in the back of the studio, and it was a 2-story building with a basement that was functional. When you walked in, there was a hallway on the first floor. There were some offices, and you went toward Jefferson Avenue. Then there was a wing that turned to the right, which was the main portion of the mansion, if you will. And this is where actually all the studios and the control room were all set up at that particular wing. The main floor had the master control room, had the announcer's studio. It also had a on-the-air DJ type studio, a large lobby, and adjacent to the large lobby was the actor's studio. And then beyond that was the sound studio. At the back of that lobby area was the grand staircase that took you up to the second floor. And there was a mezzanine around the second floor. One wing was the wing that actually was occupied by all the people from the Lone Ranger program, the writers, and Brace Beamer had his office up there too. The writers and all of the people who were with Trendle Calamure. On the other wing was some offices and another studio, if I remember correctly. Oh, and there was an attic, a third floor, just remember. That was the studio for the orchestra. On the third floor, the attic, if you will, they actually had a studio for a live orchestra, because back then in the late 40s and early 50s, WXYZ had its own orchestra. And Phil Brestoff was the leader of the WXYZ orchestra. And there was a fellow there whose name I can't recall. He was the music librarian. Now, there's one guy who was not Mr. Friendly. He was a grumpy old guy, and I don't remember his name, but he was quite a character. And you're talking about the studios and things like that, and how different radio was back in 1950 and 51. A DJ show. There was a DJ named Todd Purse who did a daytime show there. And in order to put on the DJ show, it actually took 5 people when you count everybody. There'd be the announcer, be Todd, a record spinner, a studio engineer, a master control engineer, and a transmitter engineer. It took all of those people, because the union for the engineers was pretty powerful. And so they wouldn't spin records. And of course, they didn't do the voices, but they had 3 engineers in order to do a simple DJ show, which was fascinating. But I mentioned the veranda on the front of the station. That is one of the first, if not the very first, from what I understand, that where a DJ actually went out to meet the people driving by. Fred took a long microphone cord one time back in the 50 or so, and went out to stand on the veranda on the front of the radio station, waving at the people and talking to the people out front. It later became the thing where actually the trailer was a big thing with WXYZ and radio stations all over the country too. In fact, Fred Wolf, while I mentioned him, he became, Mr. Big in Detroit as far as morning shows, and he was on the air from 6 until 9. He did a thing later on that he didn't want to get up early, so he would not start his show till 7, and he would do a live show between 7 and 9, and between 9 and 10, he would record a show without specific information about weather. They would play that recording at the 6 o'clock hour on the next day, and they would do live weather reports and things like that from the studio.
Wow.
So, Paul, I'll put myself up here for this question. So, with where you're at in around 1952, it's when we see a lot of the necessity for radio drama start to be on the wane. Can you talk about what it was like as the years started proceeding from 52 onward, and what the feeling was as dramatic programs started to dwindle?
Well, as far as 1952, I think all of us were concerned. The other actors, maybe more than me, because I was young and stupid at that particular time. And I had my whole life ahead of me. And for the rest of the crew, it was a different situation. And I don't really know if there was, nothing was said that I could remember everyone talking about what are we going to do about when this is all over. But now that I think back, and now you ask that question, I think there was an undercurrent of some of that, gee, what's next? And for some of them, I guess, well, like I mentioned, Harry found things to do, Tony Caminita and Fred Flowerday, who was the assistant director who did the directing for the Sergeant Preston show, The Challenge of the Yukon. They started a radio broadcast school. The other actors, I really can't say that I know what happened to that. I know Ernie Winstanley did some acting, went to Chicago, I believe. The rest of them, I have no idea what happened. I had my own thing going. I was a police department at that time with family, and it was just a different world. I don't know.
I can totally imagine that. There's a question that I kind of have like in tandem with that, which is like as broadcast radio, specifically within the dramatic sense, the landmark date seems to be in September of 1962 with The Last Suspense and Johnny Dollar. When it finally did all go away, at least at WXYZ, like how did you feel? How did you feel when it did finally happen? Or was it something that you kind of felt years later about like that was the end of it?
Okay, in what time frame are you talking about? The 62 time or the 52?
Well, beyond 52, like around the time the 60s hit, and you start seeing like all of it go away.
Well,
like,
as interestingly enough, I was not involved in thinking very seriously about radio drama because in 1959, I left the Detroit Police Department and I went back into radio at that particular time, which records and music and things like that. And so my focus, where I was thinking, was strictly radio at that particular time. In fact, my career went from the police department to a small station in suburban Detroit to a station in Dearborn, Michigan, bigger station, if you will. And that particular station in 1963, we changed the format from that station to a top 40, truly, changed call letters, changed the whole production setup into a station called Keener 13. The frequency was 1310. And that station, in a matter of about 2 months, went from being a number 11 in the ratings to number 1 in the ratings in Detroit. And that station became legendary. In fact, there is still a website dedicated to Keener 13. That people who just love the station so much, they've continued that into a music presentation on the internet. I became the program director of that station, the music director. So where I was at Keener 13. That was what my whole life.
And so it's kind of lovely to hear that even as dramatic programs are going away, that the need for radio wasn't strictly going away. That's a very encouraging thought, nonetheless. Yeah.
Well, it's interestingly enough, there was radio had its high notes. There were times when radio was just, it was so prominent in the 30s, the 40s, and the early 50s, and then come the late 50s, if you will, and the 60s. That was the golden age of radio too, in top 40 and things like that. That's when it was really, everybody, the little pocket radio really made radio something again, if you will. It was, you had to have a radio. You had to hear what the next Beatles song was going to be, and what were the Temptations going to do next? That kind of thing. So I could talk about Keener 13 too, but that's not what we're here for. That
not at all.
That's where I went, and that's how it went. And then after that, in my career, that station, the station was then for sale in the late 60s, and I could see the handwriting on the wall again. Didn't look good. So I had a friend, he and I actually got together and we applied for a license for a radio station in Peoria, Illinois. There was a frequency available. And we actually got the approval of FCC, and I moved from Detroit to Peoria and built a radio station where I live now. I live in the city of East Peoria, but in the city itself of Peoria, licensed to Peoria. And I had kept that station for 5 years, and I sold that station. And then that was the end of my active radio career, except doing many voiceovers. After that, I spent.
But
I could tell you,
yeah.
Peoria is the headquarters for Caterpillar tractor.
Mm-hmm.
So I could tell you how to handle a T39 and which gears to pull and what to do and how to dig a hole and how to push the dirt and what have you. I did a lot of that kind of stuff. So
I love that encouraging thought of like, so you have one instance where you see one part of radio's decline, you get back into it within that within that music engineer portion, and then there's a handwriting on the wall the second time, and so you took the initiative to just go out and license one yourself. That's very encouraging there. Like it's a good reminder of just like, if you really love it and you want to keep going with it, you find a way. Yeah,
exactly. And like I said, did voiceovers forever, and well into my early 80s, I was doing voiceovers, and then I was having some problems seeing the scripts as well as I could, and so I just, okay, enough is enough. We're not going to do any more of that. So, but the thing that is, I consider myself lucky many times over about being in the right place at the right time, which I've just explained. I've demonstrated that, and also I'm lucky in that respect, and I'm also lucky that even at my age right now, I'm 91 years old. I don't sound like I'm 91 years old. I've not lost that anyhow. I think I could continue to do reasonably well in radio. I may sound like an older man, but I'm not a 25-year-old DJ anymore. But I don't sound like a lot of people who are into their 90s and their vocal cords no longer actually are working well anymore. So
I mean, there's more than one.
I haven't suffered that.
There's more than one space needed for a voice as fine as yours, my friend. And Walden, did you have anything else you wanted to ask Mr. Carnegie?
Paul, any memories of Fred Foy?
Oh, Fred and I were pretty close too. He was so down to earth, so real, so genuine, and he was part of this nice guy group. I'm sorry I didn't mention him when you talked actors. I didn't think of him at that time. Actor-wise, I was thinking about the other guys, but Fred, gee, he was just part of the group. I remember we actually went to Fred's house a bunch of us went over there to learn how to play chess. I never did, and Fred never did either, as far as I know. He wasn't very successful playing chess, and I gave up on it too. But I know he found things to do after the Lone Ranger program, of course, with ABC. But he was Mr. As I said, there was nobody that I felt uncomfortable with at any point, at any time, even when I was office messenger. I was right on a level with those guys. Nobody looked down to me. They just treated me just like the same. I was part of the group because I was in that lounge all the time with them.
Was George W. Trundle visible around the station, or was he?
I think I saw him twice. I think I only saw him 2 times. He was just wasn't there. He had an office downtown, and that was where he stayed. He just, like I said, he was just something that everything that Trundle said or wanted done, he told Chuck Livingston. Chuck Livingston told us.
Wonderful. Jack, anything else you want to ask Paul before we let him have the rest of his morning?
I just have like one question in terms of this, in this grand scope of this conversation, which is, I wanted to know because you seem to have kind of just kept going and propelling yourself forward, which is always, again, an encouraging thought, is just you just kept going. What was the point when you started like like recalling and enjoying the memories of working in that dramatic perspective of radio? Like, did the nostalgia hit you like at a certain point in your life where you started thinking more back on it, or was it always just kind of a constant memory throughout your mind?
It is truly a constant memory. Yeah. I love talking about it. I love thinking about it. I don't think about it daily or weekly or monthly necessarily, but it's just, if something comes up, yep, there it is. And I think about the times, even the snippets of things that come up. How you mentioned, how do we spend our day? Well, the sound effects, we had a little room off of this lounge room where we mimeographed the scripts. I forgot to mention that. That's one of our jobs, was that. We were given the mimeograph sheets, and we had a machine. We crank off the scripts for the shows.
I love that. I love what you've brought to SPERDVAC today, because it's a good reminder of how it was at that point, the different process that you would go through, hearing your memories of Lone Ranger and Green Hornet and Sergeant Preston. Like, these are very treasured memories, and I just want to thank.
I forgot to mention something.
Here,
I'm sorry. You want to wrap it up? I'm not.
No. By all means, please.
You mentioned Sergeant Preston, because we talked about the Ranger, and I forgot about Sergeant Preston.
Yeah, well, I can ask it as a question. What do you have a memory of Sergeant Preston?
Okay, well, I'll tell you something about Sergeant Preston that, but for me, it has meaning. Okay. Walden, you probably know where I'm going with this, but anyhow, the Sergeant Preston show, we did that 2 days of the week, on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Ranger Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sergeant Preston Tuesdays and Thursdays. And it was the same group, same actors and everything. And Ted Johnstone, of course, Paul Hughes played the part of Sergeant Preston, and loved chili, and would have it for lunch and then belch into the microphone during rehearsals. But that's a little side note. Ted Johnstone played the part of the dog. Now, because the dog had to respond in a certain way at certain times, and you could not do that with records. It had to be somebody who would respond in a certain fashion. And Ted Johnstone, he had that particular part. He also was Inspector Conrad, who each show gave Sergeant Preston his assignments for whatever the show was going to be. And Ted was also the dog, and he did it beautifully. People would never ever guess that it was some actor who was playing the part of a dog, but he did it, and he did it well. And on 2 occasions, if I remember correctly, there was a call for a second dog that had to respond differently at a different situation than the dog that Ted played, of course, King, the dog. So I got the job to be the second dog, which was one of the highlights of my career.
Oh, that is cool.
And I will give you a demonstration. Okay?
Yes.
Ready?
Yes. Oh, God. Here, really quickly, the microphone didn't fully pick it up. Try it one more time there.
Was it okay?
No, we didn't hear it quite well. It got a little muffled. Try it again if you can.
Okay. I'll try it again.
I could hear it. Yeah, I think we got there. Yeah. Wonderful. Okay. Oh my God.
I could do more. But I think it might be difficult to get the full impact of it.
That was more than enough, and I think that's the ideal way to end that kind of this kind of panel, is to have a full demonstration of your skills behind there.
Okay, I did. We had one of the meetings here in Seattle 10 years ago, I think it was. I was on a panel, and I was talking about the same thing, and saying that I'd played second dog, and someone asked me to give a demonstration. And in the front row, were you in that front row, Walden? Do you remember that?
Was. Yep, I was.
You were?
Yep.
You and some of your friends?
Yep.
who don't see
Yep.
well, right?
Right.
And had your dogs with you.
Yeah, some of them did. Some of them brought their
I did
dogs
that.
with
The
them.
dogs jumped up. They thought there was a strange dog up on the stage.
Oh my God. Actually, Paul, I just realized there was a reason why we didn't fully hear it. Do you mind doing it one more time? That. There you go. This should fix it. Yep.
We used the script over our face like this. It gave it a sort of extra help.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think we got that there. And
Okay.
I can't think of a better way to wrap that up. But I guess I have one more question in that respect, if you're willing to answer it. Like, in addition to the dog, like apart from the dog, is there one sound effect that you had to pull off that you looked at it and thought, how are we going to do it? Or was it everything pretty much put in place to where that wasn't an issue?
You know, I've thought about that myself several times, and I only can remember one time someone had called for chopping ice, and for the life of me, it was winters that we went down to the river and got some ice and tried chopping it, and it didn't work, and we tried something else, and I don't remember what it was, and that was acceptable to Fred Flowerday.
Wow.
What we created was okay, because the way we did sound, if we created a sound, a new one or something different or a different takeoff, the director would never look to see what we were doing because he didn't want his vision to cloud his memory or his feeling for what the sound was. He would turn his head away and let's hear it, see what it sounds like. And
I remember being in a high school film or film and video class, and they talked about sound effects. And for years, I wouldn't have given the thought of like bone or back breaking a second thought until he took an empty water bottle, like a Aquafina water bottle, emptied out, and he just started crinkling it. And then you just like start turning, like closing your eyes, and you're like, oh my God, that's a sound effect that I can believe. Like, that's actually smart on the director's part to not let it cloud his impression of the sound effect.
That's funny because to this day, I hear particular sounds and I think, where could that sound be used?
Yeah.
I'll tell you, my wife makes pizza, homemade pizza on a tray. It's got holes in it.
Mm-hmm.
When we're finished, she puts it in the sink and takes water and sprays water on it, and it makes a sound that I say, that's a sound that could be used somewhere for some weird sound. so I still have a sound psyche somewhere in me.
Wow, that's a gift right there. It's something that I feel with vocal delivery. I can say that with no uncertainty. Like, just like certain things and certain cadences will just hit you, and it seems like that the environment around you has been able to continue to inspire you to this minute. That's amazing. That's fantastic. Walden, did you have any further questions?
Thank you, Paul, for doing this. I always enjoy talking to you, so thank you.
Well, we wasted about an hour here, but it's well wasted. Well wasted.
Oh,
on my behalf, anyhow.
This was no waste, my friend. This was nothing but absolute value. Thank you so much for coming to SPERDVAC's first virtual convention here to talk about the world of sound effects and the world of WXYZ. This was an absolute treat, sir.
Well, I thank you, Walden. I thank you, Zach, for the chance for me to talk about myself. Nothing could make me happy.
Wonderful.
This is the Mutual Broadcasting System.